You're an independent comic maker and you're trying to put out something really incredible, but you've got a problem. Your problem is that you don't have the huge budget, marketing presence, shelf space, and brand that the big two have. So you're playing, at a disadvantage. But there's a few very simple things you can do to help draw attention to your project that are cheap, relatively easy, won't take a lot of time, and it will build foundational audience. What is a foundational audience? We're going to talk about that. Hey everybody, this is Perch. Trying something different with audio while I'm driving, so we'll see if this works or if it's terrible. I don't know. But who knows? Maybe this whole video gets deleted, which would be a shame. I've done that before where I do a video and I talk and I talk and I talk, and then I realize that the equipment isn't hooked in all the right, so I just wasted a bunch of time. Oh, it sucks. Anyway, uh, I think that, well, first off, I think there's a couple things to recognize. You're an indie comic maker or you're a fan, you just want to consume comics, and you're interested in getting to the indies. Um, there is this perception that the big two, in terms of Marvel and DC, they're just so far ahead of you in terms of what they can do from a marketing perspective that you're at a massive disadvantage, and they're going to naturally win because of it. And I think it's important to separate what is true about that statement and what isn't. What is true about that statement is the brand, Marvel or DC, just that logo. That entails a certain level of confidence and trust. And what trust are we talking about? Well, that the comic's going to happen at all. There is a perception at the indie level that comics may never ship. You may want to read that comic, but if you're ordering from an indie, you're taking a little bit of a gamble that you may not ever get it. With Marvel and DC, there's the perception that you definitely will get that comic, good or bad. Now, I'm using the word perception here, and please keep that in mind throughout all this. I sometimes do videos, and people want to kind of argue with like the little details, but I mean, this is a lot of what we talk about is perception. We're not talking about necessarily hard and fast numbers. Yes, Marvel and DC have absolutely solicited titles that have never shipped. But the perception is that that brand brings with it a certain level of quality. Now, for people who hate Marvel or DC, you're chuckling right now, but quality meaning it's going to be printed, it's going to have color, it's going to there's a certain amount of safety if you're a comic shop and to some extent a fan in ordering Marvel or DC. You know the institution you're buying from, and so if that's a legitimate hurdle. If you're an indie, and when I say an indie, I'm not talking like Vault or Boom or Dark Horse, somebody like that. I mean like you, the guy in your living room, you, the person who's trying to do a comic book, who wants to do a crowdfunding campaign, whatever it is you're up to. You're at that disadvantage. But that really, in many, and you're at one more disadvantage too. They're playing with more budget, probably, than you have. I say probably because there's people who are able to make a little bit on a campaign, or maybe they have a little bit of a bankroll they're able to tap into, or whatever else. And what they realize is they are willing to pay more for comics. A higher page rate may put a little bit more quality into the actual production of that comic than the big two is. Now, you may say that's absolutely ridiculous, but I'm here to tell you that there are comics made absolutely on the cheap, like the real cheap, out of Marvel and DC, but especially Marvel. And so you're not playing as much of a disadvantage there as you might think. Now, granted, once the comic is actually made and it goes off to the printer, they have a whole mechanism that is an established, kind of tried and true method. If the printer screws up or screws them, then they get leverage their brand to basically make it right, which they've done many times. You don't have that advantage. So there are some economical things here, but that's really where the advantages end, and it's important you recognize that. Because if you look at a lot of the marketing that's being done by the big two, in many cases it's very haphazard. It's rarely aimed at any kind of audience. It's just kind of blasted out to everyone, and it's often very, very subpar. It's very hit and miss, and this becomes your biggest advantage. It's knowing who your customers are. When you have your comic in your mind, you may think to yourself, everybody is going to love this, but I'm here to tell you everybody will not love it. You're not going to sell to a wide audience, particularly if you're doing it for the first time. You need to figure out who exactly is going to fall in love with your comic. What kind of people are they? Are they gamers? Are they, is it YA? Is it, 40-year-olds who loved X-Men in the 80s? Is like who is your audience? Try and figure out that, because if you do, you can then very specifically market to them. I've done videos in the past. Go find the groups that they hang out in. Go if you think that your comic is something that can be recommended, get other people selling it for you. This is where you need to appeal to book clubs or to people who are looking to do reviews. Get outside of the comic bubble. That's the biggest trap always with marketing from the indies, is they try and play on the same ground that Marvel and DC are already at. And it's a very interesting phenomenon where I watch these people desperately try to get their comic reviewed by, by Bleeding Cool. That's not even the best example, but like by CBR, by Newsarama, by Gizmodo, by groups like that. And the problem is, if Marvel and DC send an email saying, "Hey, here are 3 comics, I'd like to have you review them," they will drop whatever they're doing for you, and they'll go there. That's their bread and butter. That's their bubble that they understand. That's who they're trying to serve. So playing in that game means you're going to get beat, because you've chosen to fight on ground that they've already staked out, that they're already dominating on. This is where you need to get out of the bubble. Comics and graphic novels are, known well enough that there's plenty of sites that are not core comic book sites that are probably interested to review your stuff, especially if you have an interesting story to tell. And the interesting story to tell is not a pseudo-sociological political story. It's, hey, here's this guy, he works at a grocery store at the meat department, and he likes comics, and he's always, wanted to kind of do his own comics. So in the evenings, burning that midnight oil, he came up with a comic and found it and produced it themselves. That's a feel-good story that lots of sites will want to get in on. They're as interested in the comic as the story of you, the person who created it. And if you're an indie comic creator, that's a story you have that the big two do not. The big two story is, hey, this giant corporation that has tons of money that's owned by Mickey Mouse wanted to get a pitch for a superhero team to kind of fill the niche between, this big crossover event and the big crossover event in the fall. So, they decided to commission this book, and it may run for 1 issue or 4 issues or 8 issues. We really don't know. That's a much worse story. That's not a human interest story. So sell the human interest. Figure out who your audience is. Figure out where your audience is going. And then go appeal to those sites with your story, your creator story. There's a romance about making a comic. There's a charm about, hey, I'm staying up late and I've got paper and pen and ink and I'm putting this story out. Make the story about you. The story of you is an interesting story. In many cases, and I mean no offense when I say it, the story of you is probably a little bit more interesting than the comic you're making in a lot of cases to a lot of these sites. So tell your story. Make yourself the market. Put out that comic. Appeal to this audience, and then find ways to connect to that audience. Remember, the story of you and how you're creating that comic is interesting to people. A lot of people in the business, they've lost the romance of that. They've lost the charm of what it's like, especially people in comics. They view it as a machine. They kind of lose that part of the story. If you're a writer, when you put out your comic, remember that the sales do not have to end the second that comic goes out the door. There's something called aftermarket. It's kind of the wrong term for comics, but basically it's from day one of launch. What is the secondary revenue stream for you? You're going to get some people who are going to buy your comic, come in at the very beginning, because that's how they're trained to buy comics. But think like a bookseller. Think like somebody who's going to make money in month 2, 3, and 4, and what kind of campaigns are going to run to do that. Maybe on month 2, you basically do a little video like I am, and hey, I got my iPhone here, it's plugged into my car, I'm talking while I'm driving to pick my daughter up from her gymnastics class. This is as lo-fi, low-tech as it gets. This is where you, as a writer, get on your phone, don't worry about trash audio, I certainly don't, and basically talk us through the story. Why'd you come up with this? I do interviews with people that take an hour, hour and a half, and they're great at telling their story. Well, you don't need me. I mean, I'm happy to do it, but you don't need me. Get up your phone, talk for 10 minutes about a certain part of your story, put it up. Give people more depth. Talk about what it is, you as the creator are telling a story about how you create. And that's an interesting story to a lot of people. Don't discount that. If you're an artist, put a page up on the screen and then talk through, this is what I was thinking here. I want to draw from this angle, and I want to do this, and here's 5 or 6 pages that I threw away. People love that stuff. Not as much because of the comic, although that's a natural byproduct, you're going to get money for it, but they love to learn about you. Sell you. And in this way, you're beating Marvel and DC at something they really can't compete with. Marvel and DC are in many ways paranoid to promote the artists. They don't want to do it. They still are scarred mentally from the Image guys leaving, and they're not gonna go in on you. If anything, they're gonna get film these little videos of Donny Cates being an edgelord talking about how his comic is super heavy metal, and now over here we're gonna bake some cupcakes. I mean, that's what you're competing with. That it's inorganic. It feels false. You don't feel like you're getting to know Donny Cates. You don't. You know. You're not. If you want to bake a cupcake, you're not going to Marvel to do that. None of this stuff helps. But you have the ability to tell your story. If you worked for those companies, they wouldn't want you telling your story because they don't want you to get too popular and demand higher rates. So you've got an advantage. You're able to do something they're not going to do. So do it. Your story is cool. And when you do it, free yourself a little bit. Watch some videos of how other artists, painters, if you're an artist, writers, others talk about their work. Don't go watch a bunch of YouTube videos from comic people. Now a guy like an Ethan Van Sciver has figured out what to do that works for him. Don't try and do his bit. In fact, just stay away from comics completely. As an artist, look at how other people are portraying their work. Go to YouTube, look at what has like 1 million views, and figure out what they did. Replicate that. Bring something new to comics. Don't just try and copy what somebody else has done. If you do, you have a much smaller chance of being successful. You might still be successful. If you start up as an artist and you're like, I am going to be the 2021 Ethan Van Sciver, so I'm just going to do exactly what he does. I'm going to do his kind of videos. I'm going to do his kind of live streams. I'm going to do all that. You might be successful at that, but you probably won't. Because why? Because he's already successful doing that. It's working for him. At best, you're going to have people saying that you're a carbon copy and you're stealing his bit. At worst, people are just going to ignore you and go to what they already know. That's the key. That's why I don't film videos in the car with my crotch. That's why I don't do that. That's a joke. Jesus, some people are sensitive. Anyway, these are some simple things to do to market yourself, and there's a ton more. But I hope this is helpful. Hey, if it was, give me a comment. If it's absolute garbage, give me that comment too. Like, subscribe, click the bell for notifications. But most importantly, thanks for listening.